Chapter 32. The Appointed Time. It is night in Lincoln's Inn, perplexed and troublous valley of the shadow of law, where suitors generally find but little day, and fat candles are snuffed out in offices, and clerks have rattled down the crazy wooden stairs and dispersed. The bell that rings at 9 o'clock has ceased its doleful clangour about nothing. The gates are shut, and the night porter, a solemn warder with a mighty power of sleep, keeps guard in his lodge. From tiers of staircase windows, clogged lamps like the eyes of equity, bleared Argus with a fathomless pocket for every eye, and an eye upon it, dimly blink at the stars. In dirty upper casements, here and there, hazy little patches of candlelight reveal where some wise draftsman and conveyancer yet toils for the entanglement of a real estate in meshes of sheepskin, in the average ratio of about a dozen of sheep to an acre of land, over which bee-like industry these benefactors of their species linger yet, though office hours be past, that they may give for every day some good account at last. In the neighbouring court, where the Lord Chancellor of the rag and bottle shop dwells, there is a general tendency towards beer and supper. Mrs. Piper and Mrs. Perkins, whose respective sons engage with a circle of acquaintance in the game of hide and seek, have been lying in ambush about the byways of Chancery Lane for some hours, scouring the plain of the same thoroughfare to the confusion of passengers. Mrs. Piper and Mrs. Perkins have but now exchanged congratulations on the children being abed, and they still linger on a doorstep over a few parting words. Mr. Crook and his lodger, and the fact of Mr. Crook's being continually in liquor, and the testamentary prospects of the young man are, as usual, the staple of their conversation. But they have something to say likewise of the harmonic meeting at the Soul's Arms, where the sound of the piano, through the partly open windows, jingles out into the court, and where little swills, after keeping the lovers of harmony in a roar like a very Yorick, may now be heard taking the gruff line in a concerted piece, and sentimentally adjuring his friends and patrons to listen, listen, listen to the waterfall. Mrs. Perkins and Mrs. Piper compare opinions on the subject of the young lady of professional celebrity who assists at the harmonic meetings, and who has a space to herself in the manuscript announcement in the window. Mrs. Perkins, possessing information that she has been married a year and a half, though announced as Miss M. Melvilleson, the noted siren, and that her baby is clandestinely conveyed to the Soul's Arms every night to receive its natural nourishment during the entertainments. "Sooner than which myself," says Mrs. Perkins, "I would get my living by selling lucifers." Mrs. Piper, as in duty bound, is of the same opinion, holding that a private station is better than a public applause, and thanking heaven for her own, and by implication Mrs. Perkins' respectability. By this time the pot boy of the Soul's Arms, appearing with her supper pint well frothed, Mrs. Piper accepts that tankard and retires indoors, first giving a fair good night to Mrs. Perkins, who has had her own pint in her hand ever since it was fetched from the same hostelry by the young Perkins before he was sent to bed. Now there is a sound of putting up shop shutters in the court, and a smell as of the smoking of pipes, and shooting stars are seen in upper windows, further indicating retirement to rest. Now, too, the policeman begins to push at doors, to try fastenings, to be suspicious of bundles, and to administer his beat on the hypothesis every one is either robbing or being robbed. It is a close night, though the damp cold is searching too, and there is a laggard mist a little way up in the air. It is a fine steaming night to turn to the slaughterhouses, the unwholesome trades, the sewerage, bad water, and burial grounds to account, and to give the register of death some extra business. It may be something in the air, there's plenty in it, or it may be something in himself that is in fault. But Mr. Weevil, otherwise Jobling, is very ill at ease. He comes and goes between his own room and the open street door 20 times an hour. He has been doing so ever since it fell dark, since the Chancellor shut up his shop which he did very early to-night, Mr. Weevil has been down and up, with a cheap tight velvet skull-cap on his head, making his whiskers look out of all proportion oftener than before. It is no phenomenon that Mr. Snagsby should be ill at ease too, for he always is so, more or less under the oppressive influence of the secret that is upon him, impelled by the mystery of which he is a partaker, and yet in which he is not a sharer. Mr. Snagsby haunts what seems to be its fountain-head, the rag and bottle shop at the court. It has an irresistible attraction for him. Even now, coming round by the Soul's Arms, with the intention of passing down the court and out at the Chancery Lane end, and so terminating his unpremeditated after-supper stroll, 10 minutes long, from his own door back again, Mr. Snagsby approaches. "What, Mr. Weevil," says the stationer, stopping to speak, "are you there?" "Ay," says Weevil, "here I am, Mr. Snagsby." "Airing yourself, as I am doing, before you go to bed?" the stationer inquires. "Well, there's not much air to be got here, and what there is not very freshening," Weevil answers, glancing up and down the court. "Very true, sir. Don't you observe," says Mr. Snagsby, pausing to sniff and taste the air a little, "don't you observe, Mr. Weevil, that you're, not to put too fine a point upon it, that you're rather greasy here, sir?" "Why, I've noticed that myself. There is a queer kind of flavour in the place to-night," Mr. Weevil rejoins. "I suppose it's chops at the Soul's Arms." "Chops, you think? Oh, chops, eh?" Mr. Snagsby sniffs, tastes again. "Well, sir, I suppose it is. But I should say that their cook at the Soul wanted a little looking after. She's been a burning 'em, sir, and I don't think," Mr. Snagsby sniffs and tastes again, then spits and wipes his mouth, "I don't think, not to put too fine a point upon it, that they were quite fresh when they were shown the gridiron." "That's very likely. It's a tainting sort of weather." "It is a tainting sort of weather," says Mr. Snagsby, "and I find it sinking to the spirits." "By George, I find it gives me the horrors," returned Mr. Weevil. "Then you see you live in a lonesome way, and in a lonesome room, with a black circumstance hanging over it," says Mr. Snagsby, looking in past the other's shoulder along the dark passage, and then falling back a step to look up at the house. "I couldn't live in that room alone, as you do, sir. I should get so fidgety and worried of an evening, sometimes, that I should be driven to come to the door and stand here sooner than sit there. But it's very true that you didn't see in your room what I saw there. That makes a difference." "I know quite enough about it," returns Tony. "Not agreeable, is it?" pursues Mr. Snagsby, coughing his cough of mild persuasion behind his hand. "Mr. Crook ought to consider it in the rent. I hope he does, I'm sure." "I hope he does," says Tony, "but I doubt it." "You find the rent too high, do you, sir?" returns the stationer. "Rents are high about here. I don't know how it is exactly, but the law seems to put things up in price. Not," added Mr. Snagsby, with his apologetic cough, "that I mean to say a word against the profession I get my living by." Mr. Weevil again glances up and down the court, and then looks at the stationer. Mr. Snagsby, blankly catching his eye, looks upward for a star or so, and coughs a cough expressive of not exactly seeing his way out of this conversation. "It's a curious fact, sir," he observes, slowly rubbing his hands, "that he should have been—" "Who's he?" interrupts Mr. Weevil. "The deceased, you know," says Mr. Snagsby, twitching his head and right eyebrow towards the staircase, and tapping his acquaintance on the bottle. "Ah, to be sure," returns the other, as if he were not over fond of the subject. "I thought we'd done with him." "I was only going to say it's a curious fact, sir, that he should have come and lived here, and been one of my writers, and then that you should come and live here and be one of my writers too, which there is nothing derogatory, but far from it, in the appellation," says Mr. Snagsby, breaking off with a mistrust that he might have unpolitely asserted a kind of proprietorship in Mr. Weevil, "because I have known writers that have gone into brewers' houses and done really very respectable indeed. Eminently respectable, sir," adds Mr. Snagsby, with a misgiving he has not improved the matter. "It is a curious coincidence, as you say," answers Weevil, once more glancing up and down the court. "Seems a fate in it, don't there?" suggests the stationer. "There does." "Just so," observes the stationer, with his confirmatory cough. "Quite a fate in it, quite a fate. Well, Mr. Weevil, I'm afraid I must bid you good night." Mr. Snagsby speaks as if it made him desolate to go, though he's been casting about for any means of escape ever since he stopped to speak. My little woman will be looking for me else. Good night, sir." If Mr. Snagsby hastens home to save his little woman the trouble of looking for him, he might set his mind at rest on that score. His little woman has had her eye upon him round the soul's arms all this time, and now glides after him with a pocket handkerchief wrapped over her head, honouring Mr. Weevil in his doorway with a searching glance as she goes past. "You'll know me again, ma'am, at all events," says Mr. Weevil to himself, "and I can't compliment you on your appearance, whoever you are, with your head tied up in a bundle. Is this fellow never coming?" The fellow approaches as he speaks. Mr. Weevil softly holds up his finger and draws him into the passage and closes the street door. Then they go upstairs, Mr. Weevil heavily, and Mr. Guppy, for it is he, very lightly indeed. When they are shut into the back room they speak low. "I thought you had gone to Jericho at least, instead of coming here," says Tony. "Why, I said about 10." "You said about 10," Tony repeats. "Yes, you did say about 10, but according to my count it's 10 times 10. It's 100 o'clock. I never had such a night in my life. What's been the matter?" "That's it," says Tony. "Nothing has been the matter. But here have I been stewing and fuming in this jolly old crib till I've had the horrors falling on me as thick as hail. There's a blessed looking candle," says Tony, pointing to the heavily burning taper on his table, with a great cabbage head and a long winding sheet. "That's easily improved," Mr. Guppy observes, as he takes the snuffers in hand. "Is it?" returns his friend. "Not so easily as you think. It's been smouldering like that ever since it was lighted." "Well, what's the matter with you, Tony?" inquires Mr. Guppy, looking at him, snuffers in hand, as he sits down with his elbow on the table. "William Guppy," replies the other, "I am in the Downs, and this is an unbearably dull suicidal room. And old Bogey downstairs, I suppose." Mr. Weevil moodily pushes the snuffers tray from him with his elbow, leans his head on his hand, puts his feet on the fender, and looks at the fire. Mr. Guppy, observing him, slightly tosses his head and sits down on the other side of the table in an easy attitude. "Wasn't that Snagsby talking to you, Tony?" "Yes, and he yes, it was Snagsby," said Mr. Weevil, altering the construction of his sentence. "On business?" No business. He was only sauntering by and stopped to prose." "I thought it was Snagsby," says Mr. Guppy, "and I thought it as well that he shouldn't see me, so I waited till he was gone." "There we go again, William G.," cried Tony, looking up for an instant. "So mysterious and secret. By George, if we were going to commit a murder we couldn't have had more mystery about it." Mr. Guppy affects to smile, and with the view of changing the conversation, looks with an admiration, real or pretended, round the room at the Galaxy Gallery of British Beauty, terminating his survey with a portrait of Lady Dedlock over the mantelshelf, in which she is represented on a terrace, with a pedestal upon a terrace, and a vase upon the pedestal, and a shawl upon the vase, and a prodigious piece of fur upon the shawl, and her arm on the prodigious piece of fur, and a bracelet on her arm. "That's very like Lady Dedlock," says Mr. Guppy. "It's a speaking likeness." "I wish it was," growls Tony, without changing his position. "I should have some fashionable conversation here then." Finding by this time that his friend had not to be wheedled into a more sociable humour, Mr. Guppy puts about upon the ill-used tack and remonstrates with him. "Tony," says he, "I can make allowances for lowness of spirits, for no man knows what it is when it does come upon a man better than I do, and no man perhaps has a better right to know it than a man who has an unrequited image imprinted on his heart. But there are bounds to these things when an unoffending party is in question, and I will acknowledge to you, Tony, that I don't think your manner on the present occasion is hospitable or quite gentlemanly." "Is this strong language, William Guppy?" returns Mr. Weevil. "Sir, it may be," retorts Mr. William Guppy, "but I feel strongly when I use it." Mr. Weevil admits that he has been wrong, and begs Mr. William Guppy to think no more about it. Mr. William Guppy, however, having got the advantage, cannot quite release it without a little more injured remonstrance. "No, dash it, Tony," says that gentleman, "you really ought to be careful how you wound the feelings of a man who has unrequited image printed on his heart, and who is not altogether happy with these chords which vibrate to the tenderest emotions. You, Tony, possess in yourself all that is calculated to charm the eye and allure the taste. It is not, happily for you, perhaps, and I may wish that I could say the same, it is not in your character to hover around one flower. The whole garden's open to you, and your airy pinions carry you through it. Still, Tony, far be it from me, for I am sure to wound even your feelings without a cause. Tony again entreats that the subject may no longer be pursued, saying emphatically, William Guppy, drop it. Mr. Guppy acquiesces with the reply, I should never have taken it up, Tony, of my own accord. And now, says Tony, stirring the fire, touching this same bundle of letters, isn't it an extraordinary thing of Crook to have appointed 12 o'clock tonight to hand them over to me? Very. What did he do it for? What does he do anything for? He don't know. Said today that it was his birthday, and he'd hand them over tonight at 12 o'clock. He'd have drunk himself blind by that time. He's been at it all day. He hasn't forgotten the appointment, I hope. Forgotten? Trust him for that. He never forgets anything. I saw him tonight about 8, helped him to shut up his shop, and he'd got the letters then in his hairy cap. He pulled it off and showed them me. When the shop was closed, he took them out of his cap, hung his cap on the chair back, and stood turning them over before the fire. I heard him a little while back afterwards through the floor here, humming like the wind, the only song he knows, about Bebo and old Charon, and Bebo being drunk when he died, or something or other. He's been as quiet since as an old rat asleep in his hole. And are you to go down at 12? At 12, and as I tell you, when you came, it seemed to me 100. Tony, says Mr. Guppy, after considering a little with his legs crossed, he can't read yet, can he? Read? He'll never read. He can make all the letters separately, and he knows most of them separately when he sees them. He's got on that much under me, but he can't put them together. He's too old to acquire the knack of it now, and too drunk. Tony, says Mr. Guppy, uncrossing and recrossing his legs, how do you suppose he spelt out that name of Auden? He never spelt it out. You know what a curious power of eye he has, and how he has been used to employ himself in copying things by eye alone. He imitated it, evidently from the direction of a letter, and asked me what it meant. Tony, says Mr. Guppy, uncrossing and recrossing his legs again, should you say that the original was of a man's writing or a woman's? A woman's, 50 to 1 a lady's, slopes a good deal, and the end of the letter N long and hasty. Mr. Guppy has been biting his thumbnail during this dialogue, generally changing the thumb when he has changed the cross leg, and he's going to do so again. He happens to look at his coat sleeve. It takes his attention. He stares at it aghast. Why, Tony, what on earth's going on in this house tonight? Is there a chimney on fire? Chimney on fire? Ah, returns Mr. Guppy. See how the soot's falling. See here, on my arm. See again on the table here. Confound the stuff, it won't blow up. Smears like black fat. They look at one another, and Tony goes listening to the door, and a little way upstairs and a little way downstairs. Comes back and says it's all right and quiet, and quotes the remark he lately made to Mr. Snagsby about their cooking chops at the Soul's Arms. And it was then, resumes Mr. Guppy, still glancing with remarkable aversion at the coat sleeve as they pursue their conversation before the fire, leaning on opposite sides of the table with their heads very near together, that he told you of his having taken a bundle of letters from his lodger's portmanteau. That was the time, sir, answers Tony, faintly adjusting his whiskers, whereupon I wrote a line to my dear boy, the Honourable William Guppy, informing him of the appointment for tonight, and advising him not to call before, bogey being a slyboots. The light, vivacious tone of fashionable life which is usually assumed by Mr. Weevil sits so ill upon him tonight that he abandons that and his whiskers together, and after looking over his shoulder appears to yield himself up a prey to the horrors again. You are to bring the letters to your room and read and compare them to get yourself in a position to tell him all about them. That's the arrangement, isn't it, Tony? Asked Mr. Guppy, anxiously biting his thumbnail. You can't speak too low. Yes, that's what he and I agreed. I'll tell you what, Tony. You can't speak too low, says Tony once more. Mr. Guppy nods his sagacious head, advances it yet closer, and drops into a whisper. I'll tell you what. The first thing to be done is to make another packet like the real one, so that if he should ask to see the real one while it's in my possession, you can show him the dummy. And suppose he detects the dummy as soon as he sees it, which, with his biting screw of an eye, is about 500 times more likely than not, suggests Tony. Then we'll face it out. They don't belong to him, and they never did. You found that. You placed them in my hands. A legal friend of yours. For security, if he forces us to do it, they'll be producible, won't they? Yes, is Mr. Weeville's reluctant admission. Why, Tony, remonstrates his friend, how you look. You don't doubt William Guppy. You don't suspect any harm. I don't suspect anything more than I know, William, returns the other gravely. And what do you know? Urges Mr. Guppy, raising his voice a little, but on his friend's once more warning him. I tell you, you can't speak too low, he repeats his question without any sound at all, forming his lips only with the words, what do you know? I know 3 things. First, I know that here we are whispering in secrecy, a pair of conspirators. Well, says Mr. Guppy, and we had better be that than a pair of noodles, which is what we should be if we were doing anything else, for it's only the way of doing what we want to do. Secondly, it's not made out to me how it's likely to be profitable after all. Mr. Guppy casts up his eyes at the portrait of Lady Dedlock over the mantelshelf and replies, Tony, you are asked to leave that to the honour of your friend. Besides, it's being calculated to serve that friend in those chords of the human mind which need not be called into agonizing vibration on the present occasion. Your friend is no fool. What's that? It's 11 o'clock striking by the bell of St. Paul's. Listen, and hear all the bells in the city jangling. Both sit silent, listening to the metal voices near and distant, resounding from towers of various heights, in tones made more various than their situations. When these at length cease, all seems more mysterious and quiet than before. One disagreeable result of whispering is that it seems to invoke an atmosphere of silence, haunted by the ghosts of sound, strange cracks and tickings, the rustling of garments that have no substance in them, and the tread of dreadful feet that would leave no mark on the sea sand or the winter's snow. So sensitive the 2 friends happen to be that the air is full of these phantoms, and the 2 look over their shoulders by one consent to see that the door is shut. Yes, Tony, says Mr. Guppy, drawing nearer to the fire and biting his unsteady thumbnail. You were going to say, thirdly. It's far from a pleasant thing to be plotting about a dead man in the room where he died, especially when you happen to live in it. But we're plotting nothing against him, Tony. Maybe not. Still, I don't like it. Live here by yourself and see how you like it. As to dead men, Tony, proceeds Mr. Guppy, evading this proposal, there have been dead men in most rooms. I know there have, but in most rooms you let them alone, and they let you alone, Tony answers. The 2 look at each other again. Mr. Guppy makes a hurried remark to the effect that they may be doing the deceased a service, that he hopes so. There is an oppressive blank until Mr. Weevil, by stirring the fire, suddenly makes Mr. Guppy start as if his heart had been stirred instead. Ah, here's more of that hateful soot hanging about, says he. Let's open a window a bit and get a mouthful of air. It's too close. He raises the sash, and they both rest on the window sill, half in and half out of the room. The neighbouring houses are too near to admit of their seeing any sky without craning their necks and looking up, but lights in frowsy windows here and there, and the rolling of distant carriages, and the new expression that there is of the stir of men, they find to be comfortable. Mr. Guppy, noiselessly tapping on the window sill, resumes his whispering in quite a light comedy tone. By the by, Tony, don't forget old Smallweed, meaning the younger of that name. I'll not let him into this, you know. That grandfather of his is too keen by half. Runs in the family. I remember, says Tony. I'm up to all that. And as to Crook, resumes Mr. Guppy, now do you suppose he's really got hold of any other papers of importance, as he's boasted to you, since you have been such allies? Tony shakes his head. I don't know. I can't imagine. If we get through this business without rousing his suspicions, I shall be better informed, no doubt. How can I know without seeing them, when he don't know himself? He's always spelling out words from them, chalking them over the table and the shop wall, and asking what this is and what that is. But his whole stock, from beginning to end, may easily be the waste paper he bought it as, for anything I can say. It's a monomania with him to think he is possessed of documents. He's been going to learn to read them this last quarter of a century, I should judge from what he tells me. How did he first come by that idea, though? That's the question," Mr. Guppy suggests, with one eye shut, after a little forensic meditation. "He may have found papers in something he bought where papers were not supposed to be, and may have got it into his shrewd head from the manner and place of their concealment that they're worth something. Or he may have been taken in some pretended bargain. Or he may have been muddled altogether by a long staring at whatever he has got, and by drink, and by hanging about the Lord Chancellor's court and hearing of documents for ever," returns Mr. Weevil. Mr. Guppy, sitting on the window sill, nodding his head, and balancing all these possibilities in his mind, continues thoughtfully to tap it, and clasp it, and measure it with his hand, until he hastily draws his hand away. "What in the devil's name," he says, "is this? Look at my fingers." The thick yellow liquor defiles them, which is as offensive to the touch and sight, and more offensive to the smell. A stagnant, sickening oil, with some natural repulsion in it that makes them both shudder. "What have you been doing here? What have you been pouring out of the window?" "I'm pouring nothing out of the window, nothing, I swear. Never since I've been here," cries the lodger. "And yet look here, and look here." And when he brings the candle here from the corner of the window sill, it slowly drips and creeps away down the bricks. Here lies in a little thick nauseous pool. "This is a horrible house," says Mr. Guppy, shutting down the window. "Give me some water, or I shall cut my hand off." He so washes and rubs and scrubs and smells and washes that he has not long restored himself with a glass of brandy, and stood silently before the fire when St. Paul's bell strikes 12, and all those other bells strike 12 from their towers of various heights in the dark air, and in their many tones. When all is quiet again, the lodger says, "It's the appointed time at last. Shall I go?" Mr. Guppy nods and gives him a lucky touch on the back, but not with the washed hand, though it is his right hand. He goes downstairs, and Mr. Guppy tries to compose himself before the fire for waiting a long time. But in no more than a minute or two the stairs creak, and Tony comes swiftly back. "Have you got them?" "Got them? No, the old man's not there." He has been so horribly frightened in the short interval that his terror seizes the other, who makes a rush at him and asks loudly, "What's the matter?" Couldn't make him hear, and I softly opened the door and looked in, and the burning smell is there, and the soot is there, and the oil is there, and he's not there. Tony ends this with a groan. Mr. Guppy takes the light down. They go down more dead than alive, and holding one another push open the door at the back of the shop. Cat has retreated close to it, and stands snarling, not at them, at something on the ground before the fire. There is very little fire left in the grate, but there is a smouldering, suffocating vapour in the room, and a dark greasy coating on the walls and ceiling. The chairs and table and the bottle are so rarely absent from the table, all stand as usual. On one chair back hang the old man's hairy cap and coat. "Look," whispers the lodger, pointing his friend's attention to these objects with a trembling finger. "I told you so. When I saw him last, he took his cap off, took out the little bundle of old letters, hung his cap on the back of the chair. His coat was there already, for he had pulled that off before. He went to put the shutters up, and I left him turning the letters over in his hand, standing just where that crumbled black thing is on the floor." "Is he hanging somewhere?" They look up. No. "See," whispers Tony, "at the foot of the same chair there lies a dirty bit of thin red cord that they tie up pens with. That went round the letters." He undid it slowly, leering and laughing at me before he began to turn them over, and threw it there. I saw it fall. "What's the matter with the cat?" says Mr. Guppy. "Look at her." Mad, I think. No wonder in this evil place. They advance slowly, looking at all these things. The cat remains where they found her, still snarling at the something on the ground before the fire and between the two chairs. What is it? Hold up the light. Here is a small burnt patch of flooring. Here is the tinder from a little bundle of burnt paper, but not so light as usual, seeming to be steeped in something. And here is it is the cinder of a small charred and broken log of wood, sprinkled with white ashes. Or is it coal? Oh, horror! He is here, and this room from which we run away, striking out at the light and overturning one another into the street, is all that represents him. Help, help, help! Come into this house, for heaven's sake! Plenty will come in, but none can help. The Lord Chancellor of that court, true to his title in his last act, has died the death of all Lord Chancellors in all courts, and of all authorities, in all places, under all names soever, where false pretences are made, and where injustice is done. Call the death by any name your Highness will. Attribute it to whom you will, or say it might have been prevented how you will. It is the same death eternally, inborn, inbred, engendered in the corrupted humours of the vicious body itself, and that only spontaneous combustion, and none other of all the deaths that can be died. Chapter 33. Interlopers. Now, do those two gentlemen, not very neat about the cuffs and buttons, who attended the last coroner's inquest at the Soul's Arms, reappear in the precincts with surprising swiftness, being, in fact, breathlessly fetched by the active and intelligent Beadle, and institute perquisitions through the court, and dive into the Soul's parlour, and write with ravenous little pens on tissue paper? Now, do they note down in the watches of the night how the neighbourhood of Chancery Lane was yesterday at about midnight thrown into a state of the most intense agitation and excitement by the following alarming and horrible discovery? Now do they set forth how it will be doubtless remembered that some time back a painful sensation was created in the public mind by a case of mysterious death from opium occurring on the first floor of the house occupied as a rag and bottle and general marine store shop by an eccentric individual of intemperate habits, far advanced in life, named Crook, and how, by a remarkable coincidence, Crook was examined at the inquest, which, it may be recollected, was held on that occasion at the Soul's Arms, a well-conducted tavern immediately adjoining the premises in question, on the west side, and licensed to a highly respectable landlord, Mr. James George Bogsby. Now do they show, as in many words as possible, how during some hours of yesterday evening a very peculiar smell was observed by the inhabitant of the court, in which the tragical occurrence which forms the subject of that present account transpired, and which odour was at one time so powerful that Mr. Swills, comic vocalist professionally engaged by Mr. J.G. Bogsby, has himself stated to our reporter that he mentioned it to Miss M. Melvinson, a lady of some pretensions to musical ability, likewise engaged by Mr. J.G. Bogsby to sing at a series of concerts called harmonic assemblies or meetings, which it would appear are held at the Soul's Arms under Mr. Bogsby's direction, pursuant to the Act of George II. But he, Mr. Swills, found his voice seriously affected by the impure state of the atmosphere, his jocose expression at the time being that he was like an empty post office, for he hadn't a single note in him. How this account of Mr. Swills is entirely corroborated by two intelligent married females residing in the same court, and known respectively by the names of Mrs. Piper and Mrs. Perkins, both of whom observed the furtid effluvia, and regarded them as being emitted from the premises in the occupation of Crook, the unfortunate deceased. All this and a great deal more the two gentlemen, who have formed an amicable partnership in the melancholy catastrophe, write down on the spot, and the boy population of the court, out of bed in a moment, swarm up the shutters of the Soul's Arms parlour to behold the tops of their heads while they are about it. The whole court, adult as well as boy, is sleepless for that night, and can do nothing but wrap up its many heads and talk of the ill-fated house and look at it. Miss Flite has been bravely rescued from her chamber, as if it were in flames, and accommodated with a bed at the Soul's Arms. The Soul neither turns off its gas nor shuts its doors all night, for any kind of public excitement makes good for the Soul, and causes the court to stand in need of comfort. The house has not done so much in the stomachic article of clothes, or in brandy and water warm, since the inquest. The moment the pot boy heard what had happened, he rolled up his shirt sleeves tight to his shoulders, and said, "There'll be a run on us." In the first outcry, young Piper dashed off for the fire engines, and returned in triumph at a jolting gallop, perched up aloft on the Phoenix, and holding on to that fabulous creature with all his might, in the midst of helmets and torches. One helmet remains behind after careful investigation of all the chinks and crannies, and slowly paces up and down before the house in company with one of the two policemen, who have likewise been left in charge thereof. To this trio everybody in the court, possessed of sixpence, has an insatiate desire to exhibit hospitality in a liquid form. Mr. Weevil and his friend Mr. Guppy are within the bar at the Soul, and are worth anything to the soul that the bar contains, if they will only stay there. This is not a time, says Mr. Bogsby, to haggle about money, though he looks something sharply after it over the counter. Give your orders, you two gentlemen, and you're welcome to whatever you put your name to. Thus entreated, the two gentlemen, Mr. Weevil especially, put names to so many things that in the course of time they find it difficult to put a name to anything quite distinctly, though they still relate to all newcomers some version of the night they have had of it, and of what they said, and what they thought, and what they saw. Meanwhile, one or other of the policemen often flits about the door, and pushing it open a little way at the full length of his arm, looks in from outer gloom. Not that he has any suspicions, but that he may as well know what they are up to in there. Thus night pursues its leaden course, finding the court still out of bed through the unwonted hours, still treating and being treated, still conducting itself similarly to a court that has had a little money left it unexpectedly. Thus night at length with slow retreating steps departs, and the lamplighter, going his rounds like an executioner to a despotic king, strikes off the little heads of fire that have aspired to lessen the darkness. Thus the day cometh, whether or no. And the day may discern, even with its dim London eye, that the court has been up all night, over and above the faces that have fallen drowsily on tables, and the heels that lie prone on hard floors instead of beds. The brick and mortar physiognomy of the very court looks worn and jaded, and now the neighbourhood, waking up and beginning to hear of what has happened, comes streaming in, half dressed, to ask questions, and the two policemen and the helmet, who are far less impressible externally than the court, have enough to do to keep the door. Good gracious, gentlemen, says Mr. Snagsby, coming up. What's this I hear? Why, it's true, returns one of the policemen. That's what it is. Now move on. Now move on here. Come on. Why, good gracious, gentlemen, says Mr. Snagsby, somewhat promptly backed away. I was at this door last night betwixt 10 and 11 o'clock, in conversation with a young man who lodges here. Indeed, returns the policeman. You will find the young man next door, then. Now move on here, some of you. Not hurt, I hope, says Mr. Snagsby. Hurt? No, what's to hurt him? Mr. Snagsby, wholly unable to answer this or any question in his troubled mind, repairs to the Soul's Arms, and finds Mr. Weevil languishing over tea and toast, with a considerable expression on him of exhausted excitement and exhausted tobacco smoke. And Mr. Guppy likewise, quoth Mr. Snagsby. Dear, 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 what fate there seems in all this! And my Mr. Snagsby's power of speech deserts him in the formation of the words, my little woman, for to see that injured female walk into the Soul's Arms at that hour of the morning, and stand before the beer engine with her eyes fixed upon him like an accusing spirit, strikes him dumb. My dear, says Mr. Snagsby, when his tongue is loosened, will you take anything, a little, not to put too fine a point on it, drop of shrub? No, says Mrs. Snagsby. My love, you know these two gentlemen? Yes, says Mrs. Snagsby, and in a rigid manner acknowledges their presence, still fixing Mr. Snagsby with her eye. The devoted Mr. Snagsby cannot bear this treatment. He takes Mrs. Snagsby by the hand and leads her aside to an adjacent cask. My little woman, why do you look at me in that way? Pray don't do it. I can't help my looks, says Mrs. Snagsby, and if I could, I wouldn't. Mr. Snagsby, with his cough of meekness, rejoins, wouldn't you really, my dear? And meditates, then coughs his cough of trouble, and says, this is a dreadful mystery, my love, and still fearfully disconcerted by Mrs. Snagsby's eye. It is, returns Mrs. Snagsby, shaking her head, a dreadful mystery. My little woman, urges Mr. Snagsby in a piteous manner. Don't, for goodness sake, speak to me with that bitter expression, and look at me in that searching way. I beg and entreat you not to do it. Good Lord, you don't suppose that I would go spontaneously combusting any person, my dear? I can't say, returns Mrs. Snagsby. On a hasty review of his unfortunate position, Mr. Snagsby can't say either. He is not prepared positively to deny that he may have had something to do with it. He has had something, he don't know what, to do with so much in this connection that is mysterious that it is possible he may even be implicated, without knowing it, in the present transaction. He faintly wipes his forehead with his handkerchief and gasps. My life, says the unhappy stationer, would you have any objections to mention why, being in general so delicately circumspect in your conduct, you come into a wine vaults before breakfast? Why do you come here? Inquires Mrs. Snagsby. My dear, merely to know the rights of the fatal accident which has happened to the venerable party who has been combusted. Mr. Snagsby has made a pause to suppress a groan. I should have then related them to you, my love, over your French roll. I dare say you would. You relate everything to me, Mr. Snagsby. Every, my lit. I should be glad, says Mrs. Snagsby, after contemplating his increased confusion with a severe and sinister smile, if you would come home with me. I think you may be safer there, Mr. Snagsby, than anywhere else. My love, I don't know, but what I may be, I am sure I am ready to go. Mr. Snagsby casts his eye forlornly round the bar, gives Messrs. Weevil and Guppy good morning, assures them of the satisfaction with which he sees them uninjured, and accompanies Mrs. Snagsby from the Soul's Arms. Before night his doubt whether he may or not be responsible for some inconceivable part in the catastrophe which is the talk of the whole neighbourhood is almost resolved into a certainty by Mrs. Snagsby's pertinacity in that fixed gaze. His mental sufferings are so great that he entertains wandering ideas of delivering himself up to justice and requiring to be cleared if innocent, and punished with the utmost rigour of the law if guilty. Mr. Weevil and Mr. Guppy, having taken their breakfast, step into Lincoln's Inn to take a little walk about the square, and clear as many of the dark cobwebs out of their brains as a little walk may. There can be no more favourable time than the present, Tony, says Mr. Guppy, after they have broodingly made out the four sides of the square, for a word or two between us upon a point which we must, with very little delay, come to an understanding. Now, I'll tell you what, William G., returns the other, eyeing his companion with a bloodshot eye. If it's a point of conspiracy, you needn't take the trouble to mention it. I've had enough of that. I ain't going to have any more. We shall have you taking fire next, or blowing up with a bang. The supposititious phenomenon is so very disagreeable to Mr. Guppy that his voice quakes as he says in a moral way, Tony, I should have thought that what we went through last night would have been a lesson to you never to be personal any more as long as you lived. To which Mr. Weevil returns, William, I should have thought it would have been a lesson to you never to conspire any more as long as you lived. To which Mr. Guppy says, Who's conspiring? To which Mr. Jobling replies, Why, you are. To which Mr. Guppy retorts, No, I'm not. To which Mr. Jobling retorts again, Yes, you are. To which Mr. Guppy retorts, Who says so? To which Mr. Jobling retorts, I say so. To which Mr. Guppy retorts, Oh, indeed. To which Mr. Jobling retorts, Yes, indeed. And both being now in a heated state, they walk on silently for a while to cool down again. Tony, says Mr. Guppy then, if you heard your friend out instead of flying at him, you wouldn't fall into mistakes. But your temper is hasty, and you're not considerate, possessing in yourself, Tony, all that is calculated to charm the eye. Oh, blow the eye, cries Mr. Weevil, cutting him short. Say what you've got to say. Finding his friend in this morose and material condition, Mr. Guppy only expresses the finer feelings of his soul through the tone of injury in which he recommences. Tony, when I say there is a point on which we must come to an understanding pretty soon, I say so quite apart from any kind of conspiring. However innocent, you know it's professionally arranged beforehand, in all cases that are tried, what facts the witnesses are to prove. Is it or is it not desirable that we should know what facts we are to prove on the inquiry into the death of this unfortunate old gentleman? Mr. Guppy was going to say mogul, but thinks gentleman better suited to the circumstances. What facts? The facts. The facts bearing on that inquiry. Those are, Mr. Guppy tells them off with his fingers, what we knew of his habits when we saw him last, what his condition was, then the discovery that we made, and how we made it. Yes, says Mr. Weevil, those are about the facts. We made the discovery in consequence of his having, in his eccentric way, an appointment with you at 12 o'clock at night, when you were to explain some writing to him, as you had often done before, on account of his not being able to read. I, spending the evening with you, was called down, and so forth. The inquiry being only into the circumstances touching the death of the deceased. It's not necessary to go beyond these facts. I suppose you'll agree." "No," returns Mr. Weevil, "I suppose not." "And this is not a conspiracy, perhaps?" says the injured Guppy. "No," returns his friend, "it's nothing worse than this. I withdraw the observation." "Now, Tony," says Mr. Guppy, taking his arm again, and walking him slowly on, "I should like to know, in a friendly way, whether you have yet thought over the many advantages of your continuing to live at that place." "What do you mean?" says Tony, stopping. "Whether you have yet thought over the many advantages of your continuing to live at that place," repeats Mr. Guppy, walking him on again. "At what place?" "That place," pointing in the direction of the rag and bottle shop. Mr. Guppy nods. "Why, I wouldn't pass another night there for any consideration you could offer me," says Mr. Weevil, haggardly staring. "Do you mean it, though, Tony?" "Mean it? Do I look as if I mean it? I feel as if I do." "I know that," says Mr. Weevil, with a very genuine shudder. "Then the possibility, for such it must be considered, of your never being disturbed in possession of those effects lately belonging to a lone old man who seemed to have no relation in the world, and the certainty of your being able to find out what he really had got stored up there, don't weigh with you at all against last night, Tony, if I understand you," says Mr. Guppy, biting his thumb with the appetite of vexation. "Certainly not, talking that cool way of a fellow's living there," cries Mr. Weevil indignantly. "Go and live there yourself." "Oh, why, Tony," says Mr. Guppy, soothing him, "I've never lived there, and couldn't get a lodging there now, whereas you've got one." "You are welcome to it," rejoins his friend, "and you may make yourself at home in it." "Then you really and truly at this point," says Mr. Guppy, "give up the whole thing, if I understand you, Tony?" "You never," returns Tony, with the most convincing steadfastness, "said a truer word in all your life. I do." While they are so conversing, a hackney coach drives into the square, on the box of which vehicle a very tall hat makes itself manifest to the public. Inside the coach, and consequently not so manifest to the multitude, though sufficiently so to the two friends, for the coach stops almost at their feet, are the venerable Mr. Smallweed and Mrs. Smallweed, accompanied by their granddaughter Judy. An air of haste and excitement pervades the party, and as the tall hat, surmounting Mr. Smallweed the younger, alights, Mr. Smallweed the elder pokes his head out of the window and bawls to Mr. Guppy, "How d'ye do, sir? How d'ye do?" "What do Chick and his family want here at this time of the morning, I wonder?" says Mr. Guppy, nodding to his familiar. "My dear sir," cries Grandfather Smallweed, "would you do me a favour? Would you and your friend be so very obleeging as to carry me into the public house in the court, while Bart and his sister bring their grandmother along? Would you do an old man that good turn, sir?" Mr. Guppy looks at his friend, repeating inquiringly, "Public house in the court," and they prepare to bear the venerable burden to the Soul's Arms. "There's your fare," says the patriarch to the coachman with a fierce grin, and shaking his incapable fist at him. "Ask me for a penny more, and I'll have my lawful revenge upon you. My dear young men, be easy with me, if you please. Allow me to catch you round the neck. I won't squeeze you tighter than I can help. Oh Lord, oh dear me, oh my bones." It is well that the Soul is not far off, for Mr. Weevil presents an apoplectic appearance before half the distance is accomplished, with no worse aggravation of his symptoms, however, than the utterance of divers croaking sounds expressive of obstructed respiration. He fulfils his share of the porterage, and the benevolent old gentleman is deposited by his own desire in the parlour of the Soul's Arms. "Oh Lord!" gasps Mr. Smallweed, looking about him breathless from an armchair. "Oh dear me, my bones and back! Oh my aches and pains! Sit down, you dancing, prancing, rambling, scrambling poll parrot, sit down." The little apostrophe to Mrs. Smallwood is occasioned by a propensity on the part of that unlucky old lady, whenever she finds herself on her feet, to amble about and to set to inanimate objects, accompanying herself with a chattering noise, as in a witch dance. A nervous affection has probably as much to do with these demonstrations as any imbecile intention in the poor old woman, but on the present occasion they are so particularly lively in connection with the Windsor armchair fellow to that in which Mr. Smallweed is seated, that she only quite desists when her grandchildren have held her down in it, her lord in the meanwhile bestowing upon her with great volubility the endearing epithet of a pig-headed jackdaw, repeated a surprising number of times. My dear sir, Grandfather Smallweed then proceeds, addressing Mr. Guppy, there's been a calamity here. Have you heard of it, either of you? Heard of it, sir? Why, we discovered it. You discovered it? You two discovered it? Bart, they discovered it. The two discoverers stare at the Smallweeds, who return the compliment. My dear friends, whines Grandfather Smallweed, putting out both hands, I owe you 1,000 thanks for discharging the melancholy office of discovering the ashes of Mrs. Smallweed's brother. Eh? Says Mr. Guppy. Mrs. Smallweed's brother, my dear friend, her only relation. We were not on terms, which is to be deplored now, but he never would be on terms. He was not fond of us. He was eccentric. He was very eccentric. Unless he has left a will, which is not at all likely, I shall take out the letters of administration. I've come down to look after the property. It must be sealed up. It must be protected. I have come down, repeats Grandfather Smallweed, hooking the air towards him with all his 10 fingers at once, to look after the property. I think, Small, says the disconsolate Mr. Guppy, you might have mentioned that the old man was your uncle. You two were so close about him that I thought you would like me to be the same, returns that old bird with the secretly glistening eye. Besides, I wasn't proud of him. Besides which, it was nothing to you, you know, whether he was or not, says Judy, also with the secretly glistening eye. He never saw me in his life to know me, observed Small. I don't know why I should introduce him, I'm sure. You know, he never communicated with us, which is to be deplored. The old gentleman strikes in. But I've come to look after the property, to look over the papers, to look after the property. We shall make good our title. It's in the hands of my solicitor, Mr. Tulkinghorn of Lincoln's Inn Fields, over the way there. Is so good as to act as my solicitor, and the grass don't grow under his feet, I can tell ye. Crook was Mrs. Smallweed's only brother. She had no relation but Crook, and Crook had no relation but Mrs. Smallweed. I'm speaking of your brother, you brimstone black beetle. That was 76 years of age. Mrs. Smallweed instantly begins to shake her head and pipe up. 76 pounds, 7 and 6pence, 76,000 bags of money, 7,600,000 million of parcels of banknotes. Will somebody give me a quart pot? Exclaims her exasperated husband, looking helplessly about him and finding no missile within his reach. Will somebody oblige me with a spittoon? Will somebody hand me anything hard and bruising to pelt at her? You hag, you cat, you dog, you brimstone barker. Here Mr. Smallweed, wrought up to the highest pitch by his own eloquence, actually throws Judy at her grandmother in default of anything else, by butting that young virgin at the old lady with such a force as he can muster, and dropping into his chair in a heap. Shake me up, somebody, if you'd be so good, says the voice from within the faintly struggling bundle into which he has collapsed. I've come to look after the property. Shake me up, and call in the police on duty at the next house to be explained about the property. My solicitor will be here presently to protect the property. Transportation of the gallows for anybody who shall touch the property. As his dutiful grandchildren set him up, panting, and putting him through the usual restorative process of shaking and punching, he still repeats like an echo, the property, the property. Mr. Weevil and Mr. Guppy look at each other, the former having relinquished the whole affair, the latter with a discomfited countenance, as having entertained some lingering expectations yet. But there is nothing to be done in opposition to the Smallweed interest. Mr. Tulkinghorn's clerk comes down from his official pew in the chambers to mention to the police that Mr. Tulkinghorn is answerable for its being all correct about the next of kin, and that the papers and effects will be formally taken possession of in due time and course. Mr. Smallweed is at once permitted so far to assert his supremacy as to be carried on a visit of sentiment into the next house, and upstairs into Miss Flite's deserted room, where he looks like a hideous bird of prey newly added to her aviary. The arrival of this unexpected heir, soon taking wind in the court, still makes good for the soul, and keeps the court upon its mettle. Mrs. Piper and Mrs. Perkins think it hard upon the young man if there really is no will, and consider that a handsome present ought to be made of him out of the estate. Young Piper and young Perkins, as members of that restless juvenile circle which is the terror of the foot passengers in Chancery Lane, crumble into ashes behind the pump and under the archway all day long, where wild yells and hootings take place over their remains. Little Swills and Miss M. Melvinson enter into affable conversation with their patrons, feeling that these unusual occurrences level the barriers between professionals and non-professionals. Mr. Bogsby puts up the popular song of King Death, with chorus by the whole strength of the company, as the great harmonic feature of the week, and announces in the bill that J.G.B. is induced to do so at considerable extra expense, in consequence of a wish which has been very generally expressed at the bar by a large body of respectable individuals, and in homage to a late melancholy event which has aroused so much sensation. There is one point connected with the deceased upon which the court is particularly anxious, namely, that the fiction of a full-sized coffin should be preserved, though there is so little to put in it. Upon the undertaker's stating in the Souls Bar, in the course of the day, that he has received orders to construct a 6-footer, the general solicitude is much relieved, and it is considered that Mr. Smallweed's conduct does him great honour. Out of the court, and a long way out of it, there is a considerable excitement too, for men of science and philosophy come to look, and carriages set down doctors at the corner who arrive with the same intent. There is more learned talk about inflammable gases and phosphoretted hydrogen than the court has ever imagined. Some of these authorities, of course the wisest, hold with indignation that the deceased had no business to die in the alleged manner, and being reminded by other authorities of a certain inquiry into the evidence for such deaths, reprinted in the 6th volume of the Philosophical Transactions, and also of a book not quite unknown on English medical jurisprudence, and likewise of the Italian case of the Countess Cornelia Bode, as set forth in detail by one Bianchini, prebendary of Verona, who wrote a scholarly work or so, and was occasionally heard of in his time as having gleams of reason in him, and also the testimony of Messrs. Foder and Maire, two pestilent Frenchmen who would investigate the subject, and further of the corroborative testimony of Monsieur Licat, a rather celebrated French surgeon once upon a time, who had the unpoliteness to live in a house where such a case occurred, and even to write an account of it. Still they regard the late Mr. Crook's obstinacy in going out of the world by any such byway as wholly unjustifiable and personally offensive. The less the court understands of all this, the more the court likes it, and the greater enjoyment it has in the stock-in-trade of the Soul's Arms. Then there comes the artist of a picture newspaper, with a foreground of figures already drawn for anything from a wreck on the Cornish coast to a review in Hyde Park or a meeting in Manchester, and in Mrs. Perkins's own room, memorable evermore, he then and there throws it upon the block, Mr. Crook's house, large as life, in fact considerably larger, making a very temple of it. Similarly, being permitted to look in the door at the fatal chamber, he depicts that apartment as 3/4 of a mile long by 50 yards high, at which the court is particularly charmed. All this time the two gentlemen before mentioned pop in and out of every house, and assist at the philosophical disputations, go everywhere and listen to everybody, and yet are always diving into the Soul's parlour and writing with the ravenous little pens on the tissue paper. At last come the coroner and his inquiry, like as before, except that the coroner cherishes this case as being out of the common way. He tells the gentlemen of the jury in his private capacity that would seem to be an unlikely house next door, gentlemen, a destined house, but so we sometimes find it, and these are mysteries we can't account for. After which the 6-footer comes into action and is much admired. In all of these proceedings Mr. Guppy has so slight a part, except when he gives his evidence, that he is moved on like a private individual, and can only haunt the secret house on the outside, where he has the mortification of seeing Mr. Smallweed padlocking the door and of bitterly knowing himself to be shut out. But before these proceedings draw to a close, that is to say, on the night next after the catastrophe, Mr. Guppy has a thing to say that must be said to Lady Dedlock. For which reason, with a sinking heart, and with that hangdog sense of guilt upon him which dread and watching enfolded in the soul's arms have produced, the young man of the name of Guppy presents himself at the town mansion at about 7 o'clock in the evening, and requests to see her ladyship. Mercury replies that she's going out to dinner. Don't he see the carriage at the door? Yes, he does see the carriage at the door, but he wants to see my lady too. Mercury is disposed, as he will presently declare to a fellow gentleman in waiting, to pitch into the young man, but his instructions are positive. Therefore he sulkily supposes that the young man must come up into the library. There he leaves the young man in a large room, not over light, while he makes report of him. Mr. Guppy looks into the shade in all directions, discovering everywhere a certain charred and whitened little heap of coal or wood. Presently he hears a rustling. Is it? No, it's no ghost, but fair flesh and blood, most brilliantly dressed. I have to beg your ladyship's pardon, Mr. Guppy stammers, very downcast. This is an inconvenient time. I told you could come at any time. She takes a chair, looking straight at him as on the last occasion. Thank you, your ladyship. Your ladyship is very affable. You can sit down. There is not much affability in her tone. I don't know, your ladyship, that it's worth while my sitting down and detaining you, for I have not got the letters that I mentioned when I had the honour of waiting on your ladyship. Have you come merely to say so? Merely to say so, your ladyship. Mr. Guppy, besides being depressed, disappointed, and uneasy, is put at a further disadvantage by the splendour and beauty of her appearance. She knows its influence perfectly. She has studied it too well to miss a grain of its effect on anyone. As she looks at him so steadily and coldly, he not only feels conscious that he has no guide in the least perception of what is really the complexion of her thoughts, but also that he is being every moment, as it were, removed further and further from her. She will not speak, it is plain, so he must. In short, your ladyship, says Mr. Guppy, like a meanly penitent thief, the person I was to have had the letters of has come to a sudden end. And he stops. Lady Dedlock calmly finishes the sentence. And the letters are destroyed with the person? Mr. Guppy would say no if he could, but he is unable to hide. I believe so, your ladyship. If he could see the least sparkle of relief in her face now, no, he could see no such thing. Even if that brave outside did not utterly put him away, and he were not looking beyond it and about it. He falters an awkward excuse or two for his failure. Is this all you have to say? Inquires Lady Dedlock, having heard him out, or as nearly as he could stumble. Mr. Guppy thinks that's all. You had better be sure that you wish to say nothing more to me, this being the last time you will have the opportunity. Mr. Guppy is quite sure, and indeed he has no such wish at present, by any means. That is enough. I will dispense with excuses. Good evening to you. And she rings for Mercury to show the young man of the name of Guppy out. But in that house, in that same moment, there happens to be an old man of the name of Tulkinghorn. And that old man, coming with his quiet footstep to the library, has his hand that moment on the handle of the door, comes in, and comes face to face with the young man as he is leaving the room. One glance between the old man and the lady, and for an instant the blind that is always down flies up. Suspicion, eager and sharp, looks out. Another instant, closed again. I beg your pardon, Lady Dedlock. I beg your pardon 1,000 times. It is so very unusual to find you here at this hour. I suppose the room was empty. I beg your pardon. Stay, she negligently calls him back. Remain here, I beg. I am going out to dinner. I have nothing more to say to this young man. The disconcerted young man bows as he goes out, and cringingly hopes that Mr. Tulkinghorn of the Fields is well. Ay, ay, says the lawyer, looking at him from under his bent brows, though he has no need to look again. Not he. From Kenge and Carboys, surely. Kenge and Carboys, Mr. Tulkinghorn. Name of Guppy, sir. To be sure. Why, thank you, Mr. Guppy. I am very well. Happy to hear it, sir. You can't be too well, sir, for the credit of the profession. Thank you, Mr. Guppy. Mr. Guppy sneaks away. Mr. Tulkinghorn, such a foil in his old-fashioned rusty black to Lady Dedlock's brightness, hands her down the staircase to her carriage. He returns, rubbing his chin, and rubs it a good deal in the course of the evening.